Paige's husband had told her, "If you can't trust me spending every weekend with my ex-wife, maybe we shouldn't be together." She looked him in the eye and said, "You're absolutely right." The next morning, she signed the transfer papers to London she'd been refusing for him. When he texted, "What are you doing this weekend?" she sent him a selfie from Heathrow Airport. The text message glowed on Colton's phone screen like a neon sign in their darkened bedroom. "Can't wait to see you today. It's been too long. D." Paige's hands shook as she set his phone back on the nightstand exactly where she found it. Daisy, his ex-wife. The woman he'd been meeting every Sunday for the past 3 months, claiming it was just innocent coffee between old friends. The woman who was apparently counting down hours until she saw Paige's husband again. She slipped back under their Egyptian cotton sheets, pretending to sleep while her mind raced. The phone had buzzed at 5:47 a.m. Who sends messages that early unless they're thinking about someone all night? She forced her breathing to stay steady as Colton stirred beside her, his hand automatically reaching for his phone like it was life support. The soft glow illuminated his face as he read the message. She watched through barely opened eyes as a smile spread across his features. The kind of smile she hadn't seen directed at anything involving her in months. He typed back quickly, his fingers moving with practiced familiarity across the screen. The response was brief, but his expression suggested it was loaded with meaning she wasn't meant to understand. "Morning, beautiful." His voice carried that forced cheerfulness people use when they're hiding something significant. He leaned over to kiss her forehead, and she caught a whiff of the cologne he'd already applied. At 6 o'clock in the morning for Sunday coffee with a friend. She murmured something non-committal and rolled over, giving him space to continue whatever performance he was staging. Through the mirror on their dresser, she watched him select his outfit with the kind of care usually reserved for job interviews or first dates. The cashmere sweater she bought him for Christmas. The designer jeans that cost more than most people's rent. Everything coordinated to look effortlessly expensive. This was their Sunday routine now for 3 months. Ever since Daisy Morrison announced her return to London via a carefully casual text that Colton shared with Paige like it was completely innocent. "My ex-wife is back in town. Might grab coffee to catch up." Such simple words for something that would systematically dismantle their marriage one weekend at a time. Paige remembered that first Sunday clearly. Colton had dressed normally then. Weekend casual, 5 minutes to get ready, barely a glance in the mirror. He'd returned 2 hours later with stories about Daisy's photography career in New York, her struggles readjusting to London, how she needed guidance navigating the competitive art world. She'd listened while organizing their bookshelf, noting the animation in his voice when he described her projects, the way his eyes lit up discussing her creative vision. "Maybe we should have her over for dinner," she'd suggested, testing the waters. "I'd love to meet her properly." The suggestion had landed like a stone in still water. Colton's enthusiasm vanished, replaced by that careful expression he wore during difficult client negotiations. "She's very private right now, going through a difficult transition. Maybe once she's more settled." That should have been Paige's first warning. In 4 years of marriage, Colton had never been protective of anyone's privacy except his own. But she'd wanted to trust him. Trusted the man who'd promised her forever in a church filled with 200 witnesses. Trusted the partner who'd built this beautiful life with her, brick by expensive brick. Their Georgian townhouse in Richmond, featured in 3 different design magazines. Her thriving marketing consultancy. His corner office overlooking the Thames. They were the couple other people envied at dinner parties, the ones who seemed to have cracked the code on having it all. So she'd ignored the warning bells, ignored the way he started caring about his appearance on Sundays, ignored the increasing frequency of their meetings, the lengthening duration, the late-night phone calls that sent him walking out to their garden for privacy. She'd even ignored her own instincts when those calls started happening during their dinner conversations. Colton apologizing while stepping outside to help Daisy with some urgent professional crisis that always seemed to occur during their limited time together. The shower started running and she knew she had exactly 20 minutes before he emerged, fully prepared for another day in his alternate reality. 20 minutes to lie there and pretend she didn't know what she knew. Pretend she hadn't seen the credit card charges from expensive restaurants in Shoreditch. Pretend she hadn't noticed how their weekend plans always got canceled for Daisy emergencies. Pretend she hadn't started sleeping in the guest room because listening to his late-night conversations with her made her feel sick. Her phone buzzed on her nightstand. An email from her company's London office marked urgent. The subject line made her stomach flip. European Division Director. Final consideration. Time sensitive. She deleted it without opening, just like she did with the previous two offers. £145,000 annually to head their European division. Her own team, unlimited creative control, a chance to build something entirely her own. But accepting would mean disrupting their perfect Richmond life, abandoning the beautiful existence Colton and she had constructed together. Except their life wasn't perfect anymore, was it? It was a carefully maintained illusion, like one of those movie sets that looks real from the front, but reveals itself to be nothing but scaffolding and paint when viewed from behind. The water stopped running. She heard him humming something while he toweled off, actually humming while preparing for his weekly betrayal. The sound made her chest tight with a combination of fury and heartbreak that she was becoming too familiar with. She forced herself out of bed and down to their kitchen, needing the ritual of making coffee to ground her in something real. The morning light streamed through their custom Italian curtains, hitting the marble countertops they'd spent months selecting. Everything in this room spoke of partnership, of shared decisions, and combined dreams. The espresso machine they bought in Tuscany. The dining table where they'd hosted dozens of dinner parties. The kitchen island where they'd planned vacations and discussed 5-year goals and imagined the children they'd eventually have. All of it felt like evidence of a crime now. Proof of what she was losing to a woman who wore vintage band t-shirts and made artistic poverty look effortlessly chic. Colton appeared in the doorway, freshly showered and perfectly groomed. He was wearing that cologne again, the expensive one he claimed was a gift from a client, but which she'd never seen him wear for any client meeting. His hair was styled with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for board presentations or photo shoots. "Coffee smells amazing," he said, kissing her cheek with lips that tasted like the mouthwash he used before important meetings. "You're up early for a Sunday." She wanted to ask him about the text, wanted to demand explanations for the morning routine that had become increasingly elaborate, wanted to know why his ex-wife was counting down hours until she saw him. Instead, she handed him his coffee in the mug she bought him last Christmas, the one that said, "World's Best Husband," in elegant script. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Another crisis with Daisy?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. He nodded, already checking his phone again. "Gallery politics. You know how complicated the art world can be." She didn't actually. Neither did he, as far as she knew, until 3 months ago when he apparently became an expert in creative industry navigation. But she nodded anyway, playing her role in whatever script they were both pretending to follow. He left 20 minutes later with a kiss that felt like an apology and a promise to be back by dinner. She watched from their front window as he walked to his car, noting the spring in his step that used to be reserved for their date nights. The car disappeared around the corner, carrying her husband toward whatever fantasy he'd constructed with the woman who used to share his name. She was still standing at the window when her phone buzzed again. Another email from London. This time, she didn't delete it immediately. Instead, she stared at the subject line and wondered what would happen if she finally said yes to the life that had been waiting for her while she'd been busy trying to save the one that was already over. The London email sat in her phone, unopened, but impossible to ignore. She poured herself another cup of coffee and settled at their kitchen island, letting the silence of their empty house wrap around her like a blanket she didn't want but needed. 2 weeks passed before she noticed the changes in Colton's Sunday preparations. It started with the cologne. Not his usual weekday scent, but something deeper, more expensive. The kind he wore on their first anniversary dinner at that restaurant in Mayfair, where they couldn't afford the wine, but ordered it anyway. She was organizing their walk-in closet when she spotted the Hermes shirt missing from its usual place. The navy one with the subtle pattern that she'd spent 3 weeks' worth of grocery money on for their anniversary. It was Tuesday and Colton was at the office wearing his standard corporate uniform, which meant that shirt had gone somewhere else entirely. Sunday morning confirmed her suspicion. He emerged from their bathroom, wearing it paired with dark jeans that probably cost more than their monthly electric bill. The casual elegance of someone dressing to impress while pretending not to care. "Nice shirt," she commented, folding his weekend clothes into neat piles. "Special occasion?" His fingers paused on his watch clasp. "Just coffee with Daisy. You know how image-conscious the art world can be." "Right." Because obviously his ex-wife's professional network required him to dress like he was attending a gallery opening rather than grabbing quick coffee between old friends. She watched him spend 25 minutes on his hair using products she'd never seen him touch before. When he caught her observing his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he offered a sheepish grin. Important networking, he explained, as if styling his hair like a magazine model was standard procedure for maintaining professional relationships. Must be some important networking, she said, attempting lightness while something cold settled in her stomach. All this preparation for Daisy. The transformation was immediate. His face hardened, shoulders squaring like he was preparing for battle. Don't be ridiculous, Paige. Adults can be friends with their exes without it meaning anything. The word ridiculous hit her wrong. For years of marriage, and he'd never called her concerns ridiculous before. Misguided, maybe. Overthinking, certainly. But never ridiculous, like she was some jealous teenager imagining problems that didn't exist. I didn't say it meant anything, she replied carefully. Just noticed you're dressing up more than usual. He softened slightly, but the damage was done. That word hung between them like smoke from a fire they were both pretending not to smell. Monday brought lunch with Sarah at their usual spot, a cafe in Richmond that served overpriced salads to women who lunch professionally. Paige needed someone to tell her she was overthinking, that marriages go through phases, that everything would return to normal once Daisy settled into her London life and stopped requiring her husband's constant guidance. Instead, Sarah delivered a lecture about trust and emotional maturity while picking at her quinoa bowl. You're being insecure, she said, stirring her oat milk latte with the kind of confidence people have when they've never experienced real betrayal. It's actually beautiful that they can maintain a friendship. Shows real emotional evolution. Beautiful. That was the word she chose while Paige described watching her husband transform into someone she didn't recognize every Sunday morning. But don't you think it's a bit much? Every weekend for hours at a time? Sarah's smile carried that particular condescension reserved for women who think they've figured out the secret to successful relationships. Paige, sweetie, if you can't trust your husband to have coffee with an old friend, maybe the problem isn't him. Paige left feeling worse than when she arrived, Sarah's words echoing in her head while she drove home through Richmond's tree-lined streets. Maybe she was being insecure. Maybe this was what mature relationships looked like, trusting your partner completely, even when every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Tuesday's business meeting with James provided a different perspective entirely. They'd been partners for 5 years, building their marketing consultancy from nothing into something respectable. James knew her well enough to read the tension in her shoulders, the distraction in her responses to client updates. Everything all right at home? He asked while they reviewed quarterly projections. She found herself describing Colton's Sunday routine, the increasing frequency of meetings, the elaborate preparation for casual coffee dates. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, he didn't offer reassurance or advice. He just raised his eyebrows in that way she'd learned to interpret over years of working together. The expression he wore when clients described marketing strategies that made no logical sense. Interesting, was all he said, but his silence spoke volumes. Later, as they were packing up their laptops, he mentioned almost casually, saw Colton last Sunday actually, at that new place in Shoreditch, the one with the exposed brick and the 20-pound steaks. Her hands stilled on her keyboard. Shoreditch. He said they were getting coffee in Richmond. James' expression grew carefully neutral. Maybe they changed plans. He was with a woman, brunette, artistic-looking. They seemed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Looked like they were on a date. The words hit her like cold water. James quickly changed the subject to client retention rates, but the damage was done. Her husband had lied about where he was meeting his ex-wife, and they were somewhere expensive enough that James remembered it specifically. October arrived with longer Sunday meetings and a new development that made her chest tight with recognition. The phone calls started happening at night, usually around 10 o'clock when they were settling in to watch television or read. Colton's phone would buzz. He'd glance at it, and his entire demeanor would shift. Sorry, it's Daisy. Client emergency. He'd step out to their garden, leaving her alone with the muted television and the sound of his animated conversation drifting through the French doors. She couldn't make out words, but his tone was different during these calls. Warmer, more engaged than she'd heard him sound in months. The conversations stretched longer each week. 20 minutes became 30, then 45. She found herself timing them, lying in bed, listening to the rise and fall of his voice while he paced their garden path. He laughed during these calls. Genuine, delighted laughter that made her realize she couldn't remember the last time he laughed like that with her. When he returned to their bedroom, he was always apologetic but vague about the emergencies requiring such lengthy discussions. Gallery politics, client negotiations, industry connections. Daisy apparently needs guidance navigating London's competitive art scene. And her husband had somehow become an expert in creative industry management despite never showing interest in art beyond what looked impressive on their walls. "What kind of client problems require midnight consultations?" she asked one night after he spent an hour outside talking her through some undefined crisis. He slipped back under their covers, phone finally silent on his nightstand. "You know how creative types are. Everything's urgent and emotional. She just needs someone who understands the business side." Right. Because the woman who built a successful photography career in New York, one of the world's most competitive markets, suddenly needed her husband's guidance handling basic professional situations. The phone never seemed to sleep anymore. It buzzed during their dinner conversations, interrupting movies they were watching together, lighting up the dark bedroom at all hours with messages from Dee. When she asked about the constant contact, Colton explained that Daisy was struggling with the transition back to London, needed emotional support, required advice on everything from apartment hunting to rebuilding her professional network. "She's very fragile right now," he said, as if this explained why his ex-wife required more attention than his actual wife. Fragile. The word started appearing frequently in his descriptions of Daisy. Fragile emotional state, fragile professional situation, fragile adjustment to London life. This woman who packed up her entire existence and moved to another country to pursue her career was apparently too delicate to handle basic life challenges without her husband's constant intervention. Paige started sleeping in their guest room, telling herself it was because his late-night conversations kept her awake. But the truth was more complicated. Lying next to someone while they prioritized another woman's needs over shared bedtime felt like a special kind of torture she wasn't ready to endure every night. From the guest room, she could still hear him talking to her through the walls. His voice carried differently at night, softer and more intimate than the professional tone he used during business calls. Sometimes she caught fragments, reassurances about her talent, encouragement about her prospects, promises that things would get better. She couldn't remember the last time he spoke to her with that kind of gentle certainty. The guest room became her sanctuary and her prison. 3 weeks into her self-imposed exile from their shared bed, she discovered the dark magic of social media stalking. At 2 o'clock in the morning, insomnia had become her unwelcome companion, arriving precisely when Colton's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of someone sleeping peacefully despite systematically destroying his marriage. Tonight, like so many others, she found herself reaching for her phone, thumb hovering over the Instagram app with the kind of hesitation people reserve for opening medical test results. Daisy Morrison's profile loaded with cruel efficiency. No privacy settings, no barriers between Paige and the curated glimpse into the life that was consuming her husband's attention. Her feed was exactly what she expected, artfully arranged chaos that screamed authentic bohemian lifestyle. Vintage band t-shirts draped over unmade beds. Gallery openings captured in moody black and white. Coffee cups photographed from angles that suggested deep artistic contemplation. But it was the locations that made her blood freeze. Richmond Farmers Market tagged 14 days ago. The same Sunday Colton claimed they were meeting for coffee in some generic cafe. The photo showed autumn produce arranged like a still life, but she recognized the vendor stalls, the cobblestone layout, the Victorian lampposts that lined the market square where Colton and she had shopped together every other weekend for 4 years. She scrolled further, her thumb moving with the mechanical persistence of someone picking at a wound. Their favorite antique shop on Hill Rise, photographed 6 days ago with the caption, "Hidden treasures in unexpected places." The image showed vintage jewelry displayed against weathered wood. The same display case where Colton and she found the Art Deco mirror hanging in their hallway. He wasn't just meeting her husband. He was touring her life, documenting places that belonged to them, locations that held their shared memories and inside jokes. Each photo felt like evidence of territorial conquest, a systematic claiming of spaces she thought were theirs alone. The worst part was how beautiful her photography was. Each image was composed with professional skill, transforming mundane locations into something that looked worthy of gallery walls. She had an eye for finding poetry in places Paige had always considered simply functional. Seeing her life through Daisy's artistic lens made her feel ordinary by comparison, like she'd been living in black and white while Daisy saw everything in vivid color. Morning brought the monthly ritual of organizing their finances, a task she'd always handled because Colton found numbers tedious unless they were attached to his quarterly bonuses. She spread bank statements across their dining room table, cross-referencing receipts with automated charges, looking for the familiar patterns of their predictable life. Instead, she found evidence of someone else's existence threaded through their accounts like foreign DNA. Lou Bernardine in Shoreditch, 180 pounds for dinner on a Sunday when Colton told her they grabbed sandwiches at a local cafe. Saatchi Gallery admission for two, purchased the same afternoon. He claimed they spent walking through Richmond Park discussing her career prospects. Most damning of all, charges from the Ned's Lobby Bar in central London, dated last Sunday when he swore they had quick coffee before he came home early because Daisy was feeling overwhelmed. The numbers didn't lie, even when everything else did. She photographed each suspicious charge with her phone, building a digital case file she wasn't sure she wanted to prosecute. When Colton appeared in their kitchen that evening, loosening his tie after another day of managing other people's money, she spread the statements in front of him like cards in a poker game. Expensive coffee dates, she said, pointing to the Shoreditch restaurant charge. His reaction was immediate and smooth. Too smooth, like he'd been preparing for this conversation. That wasn't coffee. We met some gallery owners Daisy knows from New York, networking dinner. You know how important connections are in creative industries. The explanation came so naturally, she almost believed him. Almost. Until she pointed to the gallery admission charges and watched him construct another elaborate fiction about attending exhibitions to better understand Daisy's artistic influences. 2 tickets, she asked. She needed moral support. These gallery events can be intimidating when you're trying to rebuild professional relationships. Each lie built on the previous one, creating an increasingly complex narrative that explained away every suspicious detail. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd practiced these explanations, refined them until they sounded not just plausible, but reasonable. The hotel bar charge required the most creative storytelling. According to Colton, they'd met a potential client there who was only available for 30 minutes between flights. Daisy had been nervous about the meeting, needed his support navigating the conversation, and afterward they'd shared a quick drink to debrief the interaction. His lies came so smoothly. She started questioning her own interpretation of the evidence. Maybe these charges did have innocent explanations. Maybe she was seeing conspiracies where simple friendship existed. Maybe Sarah was right about her insecurity poisoning her perspective. Saturday morning laundry became an archaeological expedition. Sorting through their clothes, she realized Colton's favorite leather jacket hadn't appeared in the hamper for 3 weeks. Neither had the navy wool scarf she brought him from Paris last year. The one he claimed made him look sophisticated enough for European business meetings. When she asked about the missing items, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. Dry cleaners. That jacket needs special care, and the scarf got stained at lunch last week. But she checked Somerset Cleaners on Monday afternoon, the place they'd used for 5 years. The woman behind the counter knew them by name, remembered their usual pickups. She shook her head when Paige described the jacket and scarf. Haven't seen those pieces, love. Nothing of your husband's has been in for over a month. Paige stood in the shop surrounded by plastic-wrapped clothes that belonged to other people's lives, realizing that items were disappearing from their home the same way pieces of their marriage were vanishing. Small things at first, barely noticeable, then larger absences that left obvious gaps. That evening, she started keeping mental inventories of Colton's wardrobe, not from paranoia, but from a growing need to document the systematic dismantling of their shared life. The expensive watch he wore to last year's company party. The silk tie his mother gave him for his birthday. Each missing piece felt like evidence in a case she was building against her own husband. Wednesday afternoon found her in their front garden, planting tulip bulbs for spring blooms she was no longer sure she'd be around to see. The physical work felt therapeutic, digging into soil, placing bulbs with careful spacing, covering them with earth and hope that they'd emerge beautiful when the weather turned warm again. Lovely afternoon for gardening. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried over the hedge, separating their properties. She was 70-something and had lived in Richmond long enough to know everyone's business without meaning to pry. They chatted about bulb varieties and optimal planting depths until she mentioned seeing Colton last Sunday. Your husband's got good taste in walking routes. Richmond Park is beautiful this time of year. Paige's hands stilled on the soil. Walking routes? Oh yes. I was coming back from visiting my sister and saw him near the Albert Gate. Lovely day for a romantic stroll. The word romantic hit her like cold water. He was alone. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, her friendly demeanor clouding with the realization that she'd stumbled into dangerous territory. Well, no, dear. He was with a woman. Brunette, quite pretty in that artistic way. They were walking hand in hand, looking very much like a couple enjoying the afternoon together. She described Daisy with uncomfortable accuracy. The vintage clothing, the camera hanging around her neck, the way she leaned into Colton while they walked. Every detail matched the woman Paige had been studying through Instagram photos. The woman her husband claimed required nothing more than friendly coffee and professional guidance. Mrs. Patterson realized she'd delivered devastating news and quickly changed the subject to her rose bushes and their preparation for winter dormancy. But the damage was done. Her neighbor, someone with no agenda beyond pleasant conversation, had provided eyewitness testimony that her husband and his ex-wife were behaving like lovers, not old friends catching up over innocent coffee. She finished planting the tulip bulbs with hands that shook despite the mild afternoon temperature. Dirt accumulated under her fingernails, and she thought about how deep she'd been buried in lies without realizing the soil was covering her head. Each bulb she placed in the ground felt like hope she wasn't sure she still possessed, faith in futures that might not include the man she married. The sun set over Richmond while she worked, painting their neighborhood in golden light that made everything look beautiful and peaceful. But beauty could be deceptive. She was learning the most picturesque lives could conceal the ugliest truths. And sometimes the evidence of betrayal was as simple as your neighbor mentioning they saw your husband holding hands with another woman in the park where you used to walk together. The tulip bulbs lay buried in their front garden like secrets she'd planted in rich soil, waiting for spring to reveal what she'd known all along. She cleaned the dirt from under her fingernails with mechanical precision, each scrape of the nail brush echoing Mrs. Patterson's words about romantic strolls and hand-holding that had nothing to do with professional coffee meetings. The next few days passed in a strange suspended state where she went through the motions of their life while building a case against it. Work meetings blended together. Client calls became background noise. She smiled at appropriate moments during conversations she wasn't really hearing. All while her phone burned with screenshots and evidence she couldn't stop collecting. Thursday evening changed everything. She was reviewing quarterly projections when Daisy's Instagram story notification popped up on her phone. The image loaded with devastating clarity, a gallery opening in Shoreditch. All exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. Daisy stood among well-dressed art enthusiasts, wearing a black dress she'd never seen, but accessorized with something that made her breath catch. Her grandmother's vintage pearl earrings. The ones with the intricate silver settings that took 3 generations to reach her. The earrings Colton borrowed last month for what he called an important client event that required elegant accessories to make the right impression. She zoomed in until the screen pixelated, but there was no mistaking them. Those earrings had been in her family since 1952, passed from her grandmother to her mother to her with stories about wearing them on special occasions, about saving them for moments that mattered. Apparently, gallery openings with his ex-wife qualified as moments that mattered. The timestamp showed Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Last Thursday, when Colton claimed he was working late on year-end budgets, when she ate dinner alone and went to bed early because he texted that the numbers were taking longer than expected. While she was falling asleep in their guest room, he was watching his ex-wife wear her grandmother's jewelry to art openings in neighborhoods he'd never taken her to explore. She screenshot everything with shaking fingers, adding it to the growing folder of evidence she'd labeled documentation, because calling it what it really was felt too devastating to acknowledge. The photo joined bank statements, Instagram posts, and timeline discrepancies in a digital archive of betrayal that grew heavier each day. By Friday morning, the earrings were back in her jewelry box, nestled in their usual velvet compartment like they'd never left. But touching them felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge of where they'd been, whose skin they'd touched, what moments they'd witnessed that had nothing to do with their marriage. Friday afternoon delivered an unexpected lifeline disguised as a phone call. Her boss's voice carried excitement that cut through the fog of domestic surveillance she'd been living in. "Paige, I need you to consider something extraordinary. We're not just talking about a transfer anymore. We want you to launch our entire European division. Your own team, unlimited creative control, complete authority over strategy and implementation." The salary figure made her sit down. £160,000 annually, plus relocation assistance, plus equity options that could triple her earnings within 2 years. It was the kind of opportunity people built entire careers hoping to encounter, handed to her precisely when she needed an escape route from the life she'd been desperately trying to save. "I know you've declined before," he continued, "but this role was designed specifically for your skill set. Think about it over the weekend. London's calling, and they want you specifically." For the first time in months, she found herself actually listening instead of automatically searching for reasons to decline. When Colton came home that evening, practically glowing from another successful day of supporting Daisy's emotional well-being, she didn't mention the call. The silence felt intentional, powerful, her first real secret in 4 years of marriage built on supposed transparency. He moved through their kitchen preparing dinner while describing Daisy's latest breakthrough in processing her London transition. His voice carried the animation of someone genuinely invested in another person's success, the kind of enthusiasm he used to reserve for her professional victories. She watched him dice vegetables with practiced efficiency, noting how his face lit up when he talked about Daisy's progress, her insights, her growing confidence in navigating London's art scene. When he asked about her day, his attention felt perfunctory, going through the motions of spousal interest while his real emotional investment lay elsewhere. October 15th arrived gray and bitter, matching the weather to the significance. She was the only one who remembered their 4th wedding anniversary, the date they promised each other forever in front of 200 guests who probably assumed they'd figured out something the rest of them hadn't. She woke up alone in the guest room, having spent another night listening to Colton's muffled phone conversations through the walls. No flowers waited on the kitchen counter. No card sat propped against the coffee maker. No acknowledgement that this date held any meaning beyond being another Sunday in his carefully structured routine of emotional infidelity. Colton emerged from their bedroom already dressed for another day with Daisy, wearing the watch she gave him for their 1st anniversary and the cologne that had become synonymous with betrayal. When she mentioned the date while making coffee, he looked genuinely surprised. Not guilty or apologetic, but confused, like she'd referenced some obscure holiday he'd never heard of. "Our anniversary," she said, wondering if he'd remember without prompting. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by that particular expression men wear when they realize they've forgotten something significant. "Of course. I'm sorry. I've been so distracted with work lately. We'll celebrate properly tonight, I promise. Dinner at that place you love." But the damage was done. He was so invested in his fantasy life with his ex-wife that he'd forgotten the actual anniversary of his real marriage, the date they stood before God and everyone they knew, promising to prioritize each other above all else. "Don't worry about it," she said, and meant it more than he realized. "I'm sure Daisy needs you today." He kissed her forehead with lips that felt like obligation before disappearing into his alternate reality. She spent the day alone in their house, surrounded by wedding photos that now looked like evidence of a crime she didn't know was being committed. The albums told a story of 2 people who believed they'd found something permanent, something worth building a life around. Young faces full of hope and certainty, hands clasped like they'd never let go, eyes that saw futures they were sure they'd share. Looking at those photos now felt like examining artifacts from a civilization that no longer existed. Sunday evening found her dialing James' number while Colton extended his anniversary celebration with Daisy into its 7th hour. They met at an all-night diner in Putney, the kind of place that served coffee strong enough to fuel difficult conversations and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and honest. She spread her phone across the Formica table like evidence in a courtroom. Screenshots, bank statements, timelines, even voice memos she'd recorded documenting Colton's explanations for various inconsistencies. James examined each piece with the methodical attention he brought to client presentations, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or asking her to explain context she'd become too close to see clearly. Mrs. Patterson saw them holding hands in Richmond Park, she said, showing him notes she'd taken from their gardening conversation. The same Sunday, he claimed they had coffee to discuss her client crisis. James nodded without surprise, like he'd been expecting this evidence to surface eventually. When she finished presenting her case, months of documentation that painted an increasingly clear picture of systematic deception, he looked up from her phone with an expression she recognized from difficult client meetings. "You know what this is, don't you?" he said quietly. She nodded, unable to say the word affair out loud because speaking it would make it real in a way she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. But hearing James confirm her worst fears validated months of intuition she'd been questioning, instincts she'd been told to ignore in the name of trust and emotional maturity. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while they sat in the kind of silence that follows devastating revelations. Outside, London continued its life, while hers transformed into something unrecognizable, something that would require choices she never imagined having to make. The fluorescent lights in the diner cast harsh shadows across James' face as he slid her phone back across the table. The evidence sat between them like a smoking gun neither of them wanted to find but could no longer ignore. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who knew they were standing at the edge of someone else's life-changing decision. She stared at the phone screen, still displaying Daisy's gallery opening photo with her grandmother's earrings glinting under art world lighting. "I don't know yet," she said, but that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a plan was already forming. Not revenge exactly, but something that felt like self-preservation disguised as strategy. The months between October and February passed in a strange blur of parallel lives. She continued going to work, meeting clients, building campaigns that helped other people sell their dreams while hers decomposed in slow motion. Colton continued his Sunday rituals, his late-night phone calls, his elaborate explanations for charges and disappearances, and timeline inconsistencies that multiplied like cancer cells. They existed in the same house like polite strangers sharing space and bills and nothing else that mattered. He'd stopped apologizing for his absences, stopped offering explanations she no longer asked for. She'd stopped pretending to believe whatever story he'd constructed to justify his latest betrayal. The London offer hovered in her inbox like a lifeline she was afraid to grab. 3 times her boss called for an answer. 3 times she asked for more time to consider, knowing she was really waiting for Colton to give her permission to leave by finally being honest about wanting her to go. February arrived gray and bitter, matching her mood as she sat in their kitchen at 7 a.m., reviewing client proposals that felt increasingly meaningless. Outside, Richmond looked like a watercolor painting left in the rain, all blurred edges and muted colors that mirrored the dissolution of everything she thought was permanent. Footsteps on the stairs announced Colton's arrival, though she could already tell from the sound that this wasn't his usual weekend casual descent. These steps had purpose, precision, the cadence of someone preparing for an important performance. He emerged from their bedroom looking like he was headed to a magazine photo shoot rather than coffee with a friend in emotional crisis. The cashmere sweater she gave him for Christmas, charcoal gray Italian wool, expensive enough that she'd hesitated before buying it. Dark jeans that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, hairstyled with products she'd never seen him use for any client meeting or social event in their 4 years of marriage. "Another emergency situation with Daisy?" she asked without looking up from her laptop. "Gallery politics," he said, adjusting his watch with the practiced motion of someone who'd performed this routine dozens of times. "She's having trouble with a difficult gallery owner who's questioning her artistic vision. She needs someone who understands the business side of creative industries." Right. Because overnight her husband became an expert in art world negotiations despite never showing interest in creative fields beyond choosing what looked impressive on their walls. She watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his collar with the kind of attention usually reserved for board presentations or important dates. The man looking back at him was someone she barely recognized, not the person she married, but someone who'd been carefully constructed to appeal to someone else's aesthetic preferences. "Stay home with me instead," she suggested, closing her laptop with deliberate calm. "We could drive to Bath like we used to. Find that antique market you mentioned wanting to visit." His reaction was immediate and visceral, like she'd suggested something genuinely offensive. His face transformed from casual preparation to active irritation, eyebrows drawing together in the expression he reserved for unreasonable client demands. "I can't abandon her when she needs support." He said the word abandon with emphasis that made its implications crystal clear. Abandon. Apparently, leaving his ex-wife alone for one Sunday would constitute abandonment, cruel, thoughtless desertion of someone in crisis. But leaving his actual wife alone every weekend for 4 months straight was just maintaining healthy adult friendships. The irony sat between them like a live wire nobody wanted to touch. "What about what I need?" The question came out quieter than she intended, but it carried enough weight to make him pause in his preparations. For a moment, she thought he might actually consider the question. Might remember that he had a wife who'd been increasingly invisible in his carefully curated life. Might acknowledge that she'd been patient and understanding and cooperative while he systematically prioritized another woman over their marriage. Instead, his face hardened into the expression he used during hostile business negotiations: cold, calculating, designed to end conversations rather than continue them. "We've discussed this exhaustively, Paige. Daisy and I are friends. Adults can maintain platonic relationships with their exes without it meaning anything inappropriate." He paused, studying her expression with the analytical precision he brought to financial assessments that determined whether investments were worth pursuing. "Actually," he continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a prepared statement, "if you can't trust me spending every weekend with my ex-wife, maybe we shouldn't be together at all." The silence that followed felt infinite, like the moment between lightning and thunder when the whole world holds its breath. She could hear their neighbor's dog barking at something only it could see. Sunday morning traffic beginning to build on Richmond Road. Their antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away seconds of their marriage with mechanical precision. But mostly she heard the sound of 4 years of carefully constructed life finally cracking down the middle, splitting along fault lines that had been developing for months without either of them acknowledging the structural damage. He'd given her an ultimatum disguised as a choice. Accept his relationship with Daisy or end their marriage. Trust him completely or lose him entirely. Submit to his version of reality or face the consequences of questioning it. What he didn't realize was that he'd also given her permission to end this charade with her dignity intact. She looked him directly in the eyes, seeing clearly for the first time in months. The man standing in their hallway wearing clothes she bought him, cologne he saved for another woman, styling his hair for someone who wasn't his wife. This wasn't her husband anymore. This was someone wearing her husband's face, living in her house, spending her emotional energy while giving his authentic self to someone else entirely. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice carrying a calm that surprised them both. His face went through fascinating changes. Confusion first, like a computer processing conflicting information, then alarm as he realized this wasn't the script he'd written in his head. He'd expected tears, accusations, maybe even a dramatic scene he could later describe to Daisy as evidence of her emotional instability and his justified need for support from someone who understood him better. What he hadn't expected was agreement. Calm, rational, immediate agreement that his ultimatum made perfect sense. "Wait," he said, his confident negotiation stance faltering. We should talk about this." But she meant every word with surgical precision. She was done with the entire elaborate performance of pretending their marriage could survive someone who'd already emotionally divorced himself from it. Done pretending that love meant accepting lies as truth. That trust meant ignoring evidence. That commitment meant tolerating systematic betrayal disguised as friendship. He stood in their hallway looking like someone who'd just realized they'd overplayed their hand in a game they thought they controlled. The ultimatum that was supposed to silence her questions had instead given her the clarity she'd been searching for since that first Sunday morning when everything started changing. For the first time in months, She knew exactly what she was going to do next. Colton stood frozen in their hallway, his carefully styled hair and expensive cologne suddenly looking like costume pieces from a play that had ended mid-performance. The confidence he'd worn like armor while delivering his ultimatum had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked genuinely confused about how his power play had backfired so spectacularly. "We should talk about this," he said again, his voice carrying a note of panic that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. "We just did," she replied, gathering her laptop and client files with the calm efficiency of someone who'd finally stopped fighting against the inevitable. "You were very clear about your priorities." He followed her upstairs, his footsteps quick and uncertain behind her. She could feel him watching as she moved around their bedroom, their former bedroom, collecting the work materials she'd need for what was about to become the most important Sunday of her professional life. "Paige, wait. I didn't mean we should actually separate. I was just trying to explain how important it is for you to trust me." Trust, the word that had been weaponized against her for months, used to make her question her instincts and ignore obvious evidence. Now it sounded hollow, meaningless, like calling rain dry or darkness bright. "I do trust you," she said, pulling her laptop charger from the wall outlet. "I trust you to prioritize Daisy over everything else. I trust you to lie about where you go and what you do. I trust you to forget our anniversary while remembering every detail of her gallery openings." He opened his mouth to protest, but she continued before he could construct another elaborate fiction. "Most importantly, I trust that you meant exactly what you said downstairs. If I can't accept your relationship with your ex-wife, we shouldn't be together. So we won't be." She left him standing in their bedroom doorway and headed to her home office, the room that was about to become her war room for executing the most important strategic decision of her life. The London email sat in her inbox like a door she'd been afraid to open, afraid of what might lie beyond the familiar confines of Richmond and routine and a marriage that felt safe even while it was suffocating her. But safety was an illusion when you were drowning slowly. And she'd been underwater for so long she'd forgotten what breathing felt like. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a moment before muscle memory took over, typing words that felt like they were coming from some stronger, clearer version of herself she hadn't met in years. Subject: London Division Director position, acceptance. "I'm ready to accept the role. When can we discuss transition logistics and start dates? Thank you for your patience with my decision-making process. I'm excited about this opportunity." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, before the part of her brain that had been trained to prioritize other people's comfort over her own advancement could interfere with this moment of perfect clarity. The response came faster than she expected, within 4 hours, even on a Sunday evening when most executives were home with their families. "Brilliant news. Can you start in 3 weeks? We'll handle all relocation logistics, including temporary housing and permanent flat hunting assistance. Welcome to the London team. We've been hoping you'd say yes." 3 weeks. 21 days to dismantle a life she'd spent 4 years building and reconstructed in a city where nobody knew her history, where she could be someone other than the wife who wasn't enough to keep her husband's attention. Downstairs, she could hear Colton on the phone, probably calling Daisy to describe his domestic crisis and seek comfort from the woman who was apparently better equipped to understand his emotional needs than his actual wife. The conversation lasted over an hour, his voice carrying the same animated tone that used to be reserved for discussions about their future. Monday morning arrived with the predictable sound of Colton attempting damage control. His footsteps on the stairs were heavier than usual, weighed down by the kind of regret that only surfaced after consequences became visible. He appeared in their kitchen wearing that particular expression men get when they realize they've overplayed their hand. Sheepish but defensive. Sorry, but not really. Like someone who'd been caught cheating at cards but wanted to argue about the rules rather than acknowledge their behavior. "About yesterday," he began, adjusting his cufflinks with nervous precision. "I think we both said things we didn't mean. Heat of the moment, you know, we've been under a lot of stress lately." She looked up from her coffee, genuinely curious about his revisionist interpretation of events. Stress. As if external circumstances forced him to prioritize his ex-wife over their marriage. As if spending every weekend with another woman was something that happened to him rather than something he chose repeatedly. "Which part didn't I mean?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm interest of someone observing a fascinating psychological experiment. The part where I agreed with your assessment of our relationship, or the part where I accepted that we shouldn't be together? He ran his hand through his hair, the same gesture he made during difficult client presentations when the numbers didn't support the narrative he was trying to sell. You know what I meant, Paige. You were being. He stopped himself before finishing that sentence, probably remembering how well calling her ridiculous worked out yesterday. I was being what, Colton? Emotional. Reactive. This whole thing with Daisy has you seeing problems that don't exist. The audacity was breathtaking. For months of systematic deception, forgotten anniversaries, missing jewelry, and financial infidelity, and she was the one creating problems by noticing them. I signed the transfer papers, she said simply, watching his face process the information like a computer running too many programs simultaneously. The kitchen went completely silent, except for their espresso machine's gentle hum and the sound of Colton's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. What transfer papers? London. The director position I've been offered 3 times. The one worth nearly double my current salary. I start in 3 weeks. His coffee cup hit the marble counter with a sharp crack, sending brown liquid across the surface in patterns that looked like abstract art. He stared at her like she'd announced plans to join a space mission or become a professional acrobat, something so foreign to his understanding of who she was that his brain couldn't process the information. You can't be serious. We never discussed this. You can't just make unilateral decisions about our future. The hypocrisy was so perfect, she almost laughed. The same man who'd been making unilateral decisions about their weekends for months, who'd been conducting a relationship with his ex-wife without consulting her about the impact on their marriage, was suddenly concerned about collaborative decision-making. Actually, I can, she replied, wiping up the spilled coffee with paper towels that somehow felt symbolic of cleaning up messes that weren't originally hers. Especially when you've made it clear that our future isn't really a priority. That's not fair. You know how important you are to me. Do I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Daisy's career concerns, Daisy's emotional needs, and Daisy's social calendar have been significantly more important than anything involving your actual wife. He started to protest, but she continued before he could launch into another elaborate explanation about the innocence of professional friendships and the maturity of maintaining relationships with ex-spouses. The house goes on the market Friday, she added, because there was no point in drawing out revelations that would be devastating regardless of timing. The blood drained from his face so quickly, she worried he might actually faint. You can't sell our house. It's our home. It's where we've built our life together. It's my house, she corrected gently, though the gentleness was more for her own peace of mind than his comfort. The mortgage, the deed, the down payment, all in my name alone. I bought it 6 months before we got married. Remember? You helped choose the furnishings. The financial realities settled over him like a physical weight. Colton earned well for someone his age, but he'd grown accustomed to their combined lifestyle, the kind of comfortable existence that required 2 professional incomes to maintain without stress. I can't afford anything comparable on my own, he admitted, his voice small in a way she hadn't heard since his father's business failed during their 2nd year of marriage. I know, she said, and meant it without cruelty. But that's not my problem anymore. The man standing in her kitchen, in her house, wearing clothes she bought him, suddenly looked like someone she was seeing clearly for the first time. Not the partner she thought she'd married, but someone who'd been living in her space, spending her emotional energy, taking advantage of her investment in their shared future while pursuing his own interests with someone else entirely. 3 weeks suddenly felt like both too much time and not nearly enough to extract herself from 4 years of entangled finances, shared possessions, and the elaborate infrastructure of a marriage that was apparently much more important to her than to him. But for the first time in months, she felt something that resembled excitement rather than dread when she thought about what came next. 3 weeks felt like both eternity and no time at all when you were dismantling a life piece by piece. The days blurred into a routine of boxes, legal paperwork, and the strange intimacy of dividing shared possessions with someone who'd become a stranger. Colton moved through their house like a ghost haunting his own life, occasionally attempting conversations that felt more like negotiations than genuine communication. The morning of her departure arrived gray and drizzling. London weather that somehow felt appropriate for endings. She was sealing the last of her boxes when the doorbell rang with the persistence of someone who had news that couldn't wait. James stood on her front step with his laptop tucked under his arm and an expression she recognized from their most difficult client meetings. The look he wore when he discovered something significant that no one was going to want to hear. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into her hallway without waiting for invitation. "Before you leave, there's something you should see." He set his laptop on their dining room table, the same table where Colton and she used to plan dinner parties and discuss weekend trips they'd never take. The screen loaded with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd spent considerable time organizing evidence. "I was running social media analytics for that gallery client," James began, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. "Daisy Morrison's name came up in the data, so I did some deeper research. What I found changes everything." The screen filled with screenshots, timestamps, and social media posts arranged with the kind of systematic organization that made her marketing background appreciate the thoroughness even while her heart sank at the implications. "The Sunday brunches," James said, clicking through images that loaded like evidence in a courtroom presentation. "They weren't emergency counseling sessions at local cafes. Look at these locations." The photos told a different story than any Colton had ever shared with her. Sketch, the trendy Shoreditch restaurant with the 40 pounds tasting menu. Chiltern Firehouse, where celebrities went to be photographed. The River Cafe, which required reservations booked months in advance and cost more per meal than most people's weekly grocery budget. These weren't the kind of places you grab coffee to help someone through a professional crisis. These were deliberate destinations, the kind of restaurants where people went to impress each other, to create memories, to mark occasions that mattered. "She's been documenting everything," James continued, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering devastating news as gently as possible. "Not just meals, but activities. Look at this." The apartment hunting photos made her stomach turn. Not just any properties, but specific listings in Richmond, streets within walking distance of their house, neighborhoods where she could easily become part of their daily routine, places where running into them would feel natural rather than coincidental. But the most devastating evidence came from what James called Daisy's professional portfolio, an entire photography series titled New Beginnings that had been developing parallel to her relationship with her husband. The images loaded with artistic precision that made their emotional impact even more brutal. Their favorite pub, the White Swan, captured in golden hour lighting that transformed the familiar space into something that looked romantic and intimate. The antique shops on Hill Rise where Colton and she used to browse on lazy Saturday afternoons, now serving as backdrop for artistic compositions that suggested someone documenting their systematic reclamation of territory. Even Richmond Farmers Market appeared in her portfolio, photographed with the eye of someone who understood the emotional significance of shared spaces and wanted to claim them for her own narrative. "Each image is dated," James said, pointing to timestamps that revealed the scope of what had been happening. "This isn't casual documentation. This is someone deliberately creating a visual record of replacing another woman's life, one location at a time." The photography was undeniably beautiful. Each image composed with professional skill that transformed mundane locations into something that looked worthy of gallery walls. But knowing the context made every artistic choice feel like violence. Every carefully framed shot like evidence of calculated invasion. "There's more," James said, his voice getting quieter as he clicked through folders organized by date and location. "The timeline doesn't match anything Colton's told you." The timestamps revealed a pattern that made 4 months of lies suddenly visible in high resolution. Gallery openings they attended together while she worked late on client presentations, believing she was supporting their shared financial goals. Weekend trips to Bath, the same trip she'd suggested for them multiple times, which Colton had dismissed as impractical and expensive. The evidence spanned months, revealing not just infidelity, but an elaborate campaign of manipulation that made her previous understanding of their situation seem naive by comparison. While Colton was telling her about Daisy's fragility and professional struggles, she was documenting their romance like a victory lap, creating permanent records of moments that were supposed to be healing conversations between old friends. "She's been planning this whole thing," Paige said, scrolling through images that showed increasing intimacy and confidence. This wasn't accidental emotional reconnection. This was systematic. James nodded, closing the laptop with the finality of someone who'd finished presenting a case they wished they didn't have to make. I'm sorry, Paige. I know this makes everything worse. But he was wrong. Seeing the evidence didn't make everything worse. It made everything clear. For 4 months, she'd been questioning her instincts, wondering if she was overreacting to innocent friendship, letting Sarah's lectures about trust and maturity convince her that her concerns were signs of personal inadequacy rather than accurate readings of genuine threats. Now she understood that her instincts weren't just correct, they were conservative. The situation was worse than she'd imagined, more calculated and deliberate than her worst suspicions had suggested. 2 hours later, she was standing in the departure lounge at Heathrow, surrounded by the carefully packed remnants of her Richmond life. The morning's revelations felt like final pieces of a puzzle she didn't realize she'd been solving, completing a picture that explained not just what happened, but why every attempt to fix their marriage had been doomed from the start. You can't repair something when one person is systematically dismantling it while pretending to help with maintenance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colton. "What are you doing this weekend?" The question carried assumptions that would have been accurate a week ago. That she was sitting in some dreary temporary accommodation, regretting her hasty decision, reconsidering the dramatic step of leaving their life together. That the reality of London would feel overwhelming compared to the comfort of Richmond routine, even if that routine had become poisonous. Instead, she looked around the departure lounge filled with people heading toward new adventures, new possibilities, new versions of themselves they hadn't met yet. For the first time in months, she felt something that resembled excitement rather than dread when she thought about what came next. She took a selfie against the backdrop of departure boards displaying destinations that sounded like freedom. Paris, Amsterdam, Rome, and at the top of the list, London. Her boarding pass was visible in the frame. Genuine smile replacing months of forced cheerfulness that had fooled everyone except herself. "Starting my new life," she typed, adding the photo before hitting send. The response came immediately. "Wait, you're actually leaving? Come home. We can work this out." But she was already boarding, phone switching to airplane mode as her London, waited ahead. Behind her, Richmond shrank to the size of a problem she used to have. While ahead lay a city where nobody knew her history, where she could be someone other than the wife who wasn't enough to keep her husband's attention. The plane lifted off, carrying her away from 4 years of carefully constructed lies and toward 3 weeks of evidence that finally made sense of everything that never made sense before. The plane touched down at Heathrow with the gentle bump of new beginnings meeting solid ground. Through the small, oval window, London spread out beneath gray skies that somehow looked more promising than Richmond's familiar sunshine ever did. She was 32 years old, carrying 2 suitcases and a laptop bag that contained everything she needed to build a life that belonged entirely to her. The flat in Shoreditch exceeded every expectation her company's relocation team had set. Exposed brick walls that had witnessed decades of London stories. Industrial lighting that made everything look like it belonged in a design magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline like a painting that changed with every shift of light and weather. Her first morning, she stood at those windows with coffee from the artisanal roaster 3 floors below, watching London wake up around her. The coffee tasted different here. Not just the beans or the brewing method, but the experience of drinking it without wondering where her husband really spent yesterday, without analyzing text messages for hidden meanings, without that constant low-level anxiety that had become so normal she'd forgotten what peace felt like. The office building in Canary Wharf hummed with the kind of creative energy she'd forgotten was possible in professional environments. Her new team was hungry, innovative, eager to prove themselves in ways that made her remember why she loved marketing before it became just another routine supporting a life that was slowly suffocating her. Within 2 weeks, she'd implemented 3 strategies that increased client retention by 30%. The success felt different than her Richmond achievements. Not just professional validation, but proof that she could build something meaningful when she wasn't constantly managing someone else's emotional crisis. For the first time in months, she went entire days without compulsively checking her phone, without wondering if the person who claimed to love her was lying to her face, without feeling like she was walking on emotional landmines disguised as normal conversations. Back in Richmond, according to mutual friends who couldn't resist sharing updates, her departure created exactly the kind of chaos she'd hoped to avoid but secretly knew was inevitable. Colton's carefully managed double life imploded spectacularly once she removed herself from the equation. Sarah, her former lunch companion and relationship advisor, proved surprisingly eager to share details about the aftermath of her strategic withdrawal. Daisy expected a completely different outcome. She told Paige during one of her update calls that felt more like entertainment than genuine concern. She thought the Sunday sessions were courtship leading to commitment, that Colton was building toward leaving you for her. The irony was perfect. When Paige preemptively ended the triangle by removing herself entirely, Daisy found herself in the awkward position of being the other woman in a relationship that no longer existed. Her response, according to Sarah's breathless reporting, was swift and artistically devastating. The New Beginnings photography series that had documented her systematic replacement of Paige's life was updated with a new collection titled False Starts. Stark black and white images of empty restaurant tables, abandoned coffee cups, solitary figures in locations that had once represented possibility but now spoke only of betrayal and miscalculation. The artistic statement was clear. She'd been played just as thoroughly as Paige had, cast as the romantic heroine in a story where the male protagonist had never actually committed to anything beyond ego gratification and weekend entertainment. The Richmond house sold within 6 weeks. The Georgian townhouse featured in design magazines was purchased by a young couple who probably imagined they'd build the kind of lasting partnership Colton and Paige had pretended to create. The proceeds, after paying off her mortgage, gave her the kind of financial freedom that made London feel less like escape and more like investment in her actual future. 6 months into her new life, she received an unexpected message through LinkedIn, a professional platform that felt appropriately neutral for what turned out to be the most important conversation she never knew she needed to have. Daisy Morrison requested a private meeting, her message carefully worded and devoid of the artistic flair that characterized her social media presence. They agreed to meet at a cafe in Covent Garden, neutral territory where neither of them had history or emotional investment. She looked smaller than Paige had imagined, more fragile than the confident bohemian goddess she'd constructed in her mind during months of social media surveillance. The exhaustion in her eyes spoke to the specific kind of weariness that comes from realizing you've been cast as the villain in someone else's story without understanding the script. "I wanted to apologize," she said without preamble, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was anchoring her to the conversation, for everything. For believing things that weren't true, for participating in something that hurt you, for not asking the right questions. She paused, staring into her cup like it contained answers to questions she was still learning to ask. "Colton told me your marriage was essentially over," she continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. "That you were just going through the motions until it was convenient to divorce. That you'd grown apart and were staying together for financial reasons." The audacity was breathtaking, but Paige found herself feeling something unexpected, pity rather than anger. "And you believed him?" "I wanted to," she admitted with the kind of honesty that only comes after consequences make denial impossible. It made everything easier to justify. The restaurant dates, the photography project, the apartment hunting in your neighborhood. If your marriage was already dead, then I wasn't really destroying anything. The conversation lasted 2 hours, 2 women dissecting the elaborate fiction one man had constructed to serve his ego, while keeping both of them invested in competing versions of the same fantasy. Colton had been playing both sides masterfully, painting Paige as controlling and suspicious to her, while portraying Daisy as needy and fragile to Paige. "I've been where you were," she said as they prepared to leave. The wife wondering why her husband needs so much friendship from his ex. "It's devastating, and I helped do that to you." As their conversation ended, she delivered the perfect coda to what Paige was finally comfortable calling her revenge story, though revenge implied more active malice than what actually happened. "He's completely alone now," she said, gathering her vintage leather jacket with movements that suggested someone who'd learned to carry disappointment with artistic grace. The house sold. He's renting some dreary flat in Clapham, spending weekends watching Netflix instead of curating relationships with women who don't really know him. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Colton, who'd been so desperate for female attention that he'd maintained relationships with both his wife and ex-wife simultaneously, now had neither. The man who'd needed constant validation from multiple sources to feel interesting had discovered what it was like to be genuinely alone with himself. Walking back to her Shoreditch flat through streets lined with galleries and cafes that defined her new life, Paige realized something profound had shifted in how she understood what happened to them. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger required ongoing emotional investment in someone else's choices, and she'd redirected that energy toward building something that actually served her interests. Instead, she was grateful. Grateful that Colton was arrogant enough to deliver that ultimatum. Grateful that he underestimated her willingness to call his bluff. Grateful that he freed her from a marriage that was slowly suffocating everything authentic about who she used to be. Sometimes people do you the greatest favor of your life by showing you exactly who they are. Colton showed her he was someone who would choose drama over stability, ego gratification over partnership, manipulation over honest communication. And in showing her who he really was, he also revealed who she could become. Someone who refuses to accept less than she deserves. Someone who chooses herself when others won't. Someone who finally learned that you can't save a relationship with someone who's already emotionally left. Every morning when she woke up in her warehouse flat, watching London come alive outside her windows, she remembered that moment in their Richmond kitchen when everything changed. The moment she stopped fighting for someone who wasn't fighting for them and started fighting for herself instead. She finally chose herself, and it was the best decision she'd ever made.